When organizations talk about governance, they often describe what should happen when everyone has time to think, meet, and carefully document decisions. But real enterprises make their hardest decisions when time is short and pressure is high. Under pressure, people default to habits, shortcuts, and whatever seems fastest in the moment, which is exactly when policies and standards either protect the enterprise or get bypassed entirely. The goal of this episode is to show you how governance builds policies and standards that are strong enough to steer decisions in the messy reality of deadlines, incidents, and competing priorities. If policies are vague, nobody can apply them quickly, and the loudest voice wins. If standards are unclear, teams interpret them differently, and the enterprise drifts into inconsistency and hidden risk. By the end, you should be able to explain the difference between a policy and a standard, why both must be designed for pressure, and how leaders make compliance the easiest and most defensible path when emotions and urgency are high. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGEIT.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical way to begin is to clarify what policies and standards each do, because they solve different problems and both are needed to guide decisions quickly. A policy is leadership direction that sets the boundaries and expectations for behavior, like a rule that certain types of risk must be explicitly accepted by appropriate authority. A standard turns that policy into consistent requirements that can be applied repeatedly, like defining what evidence must exist for risk acceptance and what minimum controls apply to high-impact systems. Policies give the enterprise the why and the non-negotiable boundaries, while standards give the enterprise the how to be consistent in measurable ways. Under time pressure, people do not have the bandwidth to interpret long policy documents, so policies must be short, clear, and oriented around decision boundaries. Standards must also be easy to apply, because a standard that requires specialized interpretation will be skipped when deadlines loom. Beginners often think more detail equals more control, but too much detail can slow decisions and invite workarounds. The governance skill is designing policies and standards that are clear enough to guide behavior quickly and precise enough to prevent loopholes. Time pressure changes decision behavior in predictable ways, and understanding that human reality helps you design policies that actually work. Under urgency, people use heuristics, meaning they simplify, rely on what worked before, and prioritize immediate relief over long-term consequences. They also become more willing to accept risk silently, especially if escalation feels slow or if admitting risk might delay a deliverable. Teams may bypass governance steps not because they dislike governance, but because they believe governance will block progress and they feel accountable for delivering something now. Policies and standards that steer under pressure must therefore anticipate the temptation to shortcut, and they must provide safe, fast paths that preserve accountability. This is why good governance does not just say follow the process. It builds a process that can be followed quickly without sacrificing core protections. Beginners sometimes assume discipline comes from willpower, but governance relies on system design that makes the disciplined choice the natural choice. When you design policies and standards with pressure in mind, you reduce the need for heroics and reduce the frequency of crises created by rushed decisions. To steer decisions under time pressure, policies must focus on decision rights and thresholds, because urgency usually triggers the question of who is allowed to decide and how much risk they can accept. A policy that says all risk must be minimized is not helpful in a crisis, because it provides no way to choose a trade-off. A policy that says high-impact risk acceptance requires defined authority is helpful because it creates a boundary that people can apply quickly. Thresholds can be based on enterprise impact, such as affecting critical services, regulated data, or significant financial exposure, because those are areas where mistakes carry large consequences. When thresholds are clear, teams can act quickly within delegated authority for low-risk decisions and escalate quickly for high-risk decisions without debating whether escalation is necessary. This protects the enterprise because it prevents silent acceptance of big risk while still allowing fast movement where risk is low. Beginners often think thresholds are loopholes, but they are actually how governance preserves speed while focusing oversight on what matters. A policy that includes clear thresholds is easier to follow under pressure because it reduces the cognitive load of deciding what governance expects. Standards must be designed as ready-to-use guardrails, meaning they should be specific enough that a team can apply them during a stressful moment without needing an expert to interpret them. For example, a standard might define required review steps for high-impact changes or define minimum logging expectations for critical systems, but it must do so in a way that is consistent and practical. If the standard is too complex, teams will interpret it differently or avoid it. If the standard is too vague, teams will claim they complied while still making risky choices. A well-designed standard has a clear scope, a clear requirement, and a clear way to show it was met, because evidence is what protects accountability when the decision is questioned later. Under time pressure, teams need clarity about what must not be skipped, and standards provide that clarity when they are written as essential requirements rather than as optional guidelines. Beginners sometimes confuse standards with procedures, but standards are not step-by-step instructions. They are consistent expectations that can be implemented through different operational methods as long as the requirement is met. This distinction keeps standards stable and usable even as tools and processes evolve. Policies and standards steer decisions best when they are connected to enterprise objectives, because objective alignment makes the rules feel legitimate rather than arbitrary. If the enterprise objective is customer trust, then policies and standards around data handling, incident response, and reliability are not random restrictions. They are direct supports for trust outcomes. If the objective is speed with acceptable risk, then policies should define risk boundaries and escalation, and standards should define minimal control requirements that allow speed without reckless exposure. If the objective is cost discipline, then standards around reuse of shared services and avoidance of duplicated capabilities support that objective by preventing wasteful fragmentation. Under pressure, legitimacy matters because people are more likely to comply quickly when they believe the rule protects something the enterprise truly values. When a rule feels disconnected from objectives, people treat it as bureaucratic overhead and rationalize bypassing it. Governance, therefore, should be able to explain, in simple terms, what enterprise objective a policy supports and what failure the policy prevents. Beginners should understand that this explanation is not marketing. It is part of control effectiveness, because belief and adoption influence whether governance is followed under stress. A major reason policies fail under pressure is that they do not provide a credible exception path, so teams assume the only way to move fast is to ignore governance entirely. An exception path is not a loophole. It is a controlled mechanism for handling situations where constraints make full compliance difficult, while keeping risk acceptance visible and owned. A strong policy environment defines who can approve exceptions, what justification is required, what risks are introduced, and how the exception will be revisited. Under time pressure, the exception path must be fast enough to be usable, which means governance must define streamlined approvals for urgent cases while preserving accountability for high-impact decisions. Standards support this by defining what minimum protections cannot be waived even under urgency, such as certain access controls or certain evidence requirements. This approach prevents the most damaging pattern of all, which is silent exceptions that become permanent because no one tracked them. Beginners often think exceptions indicate weak governance, but the opposite is true. A governance system that can handle exceptions responsibly is more resilient under pressure. The real weakness is unmanaged exceptions, because they create hidden risk and make future decisions inconsistent. Another key element is designing policies and standards to reduce decision friction, because friction is the fuel that drives bypass behavior. Decision friction increases when people are unsure what is required, unsure who decides, or unsure how long approval will take, especially during a crisis. Governance reduces friction by standardizing decision inputs, such as requiring the same basic information for risk acceptance or change approval, so decision makers can respond quickly. It also reduces friction by ensuring decision forums are available and responsive, because a policy that requires escalation to a group that meets infrequently will not steer decisions under time pressure. Governance can also reduce friction by using shared services and reusable controls, so teams do not have to invent compliance approaches for each initiative. When friction is low, compliance becomes faster than bypassing, because bypassing creates uncertainty and risk that teams do not want to carry alone. Beginners often interpret governance as added friction, but good governance is engineered to reduce total friction by preventing rework, preventing surprise audits, and preventing incidents that consume massive time. Policies and standards that steer under pressure are therefore designed with usability as a first-class requirement, not as an afterthought. Evidence is the backbone of steering under pressure because it protects both the enterprise and the decision-makers after the fact when someone asks why a risky decision was made. Under urgency, people may accept risk to keep operations running, but governance requires that acceptance be documented enough to be traceable, not because governance loves paperwork, but because traceability enables accountability and learning. Standards should define what evidence must exist for key decisions, such as a record of who approved an exception and what risk was accepted, along with what remediation is expected. When evidence is standardized, decision-makers can act quickly because they know exactly what must be captured and how it will be reviewed later. This also prevents scapegoating, because the enterprise can see that a decision followed policy boundaries and was approved by the correct authority. For beginners, it helps to think of evidence as a seatbelt. You hope you never need it, but when something goes wrong, it protects you and clarifies what happened. Evidence also enables continuous improvement, because governance can analyze patterns of exceptions and rush decisions and adjust policies and standards to reduce recurrence. Policies and standards also need to include decision sequencing, because pressure often causes people to solve the wrong problem first. In governance, sequencing means knowing what must be established before other actions make sense, such as clarifying ownership before demanding outcomes, or defining risk tolerance before approving risky shortcuts. Under time pressure, teams may jump directly to implementing a workaround without confirming who has authority to accept the risk created by that workaround. A policy that sets sequencing expectations helps steer decisions by reminding leaders that some actions require explicit approval and some require coordination across owners. Standards can reinforce sequencing by defining checkpoints where certain conditions must be met before proceeding, such as ensuring a critical service has an accountable owner and monitoring expectations before a major release. This does not mean the enterprise cannot move quickly. It means the enterprise moves quickly in the right order so speed does not turn into chaos. Beginners often assume the fastest path is to skip steps, but in many cases the fastest sustainable path is to follow the steps that prevent failure. Sequencing is therefore a governance efficiency strategy as much as a risk strategy, and it becomes crucial under pressure. A common beginner misunderstanding is thinking that policies and standards should attempt to cover every scenario, because people worry that any ambiguity will be exploited. In practice, overly detailed policies become unreadable and unworkable under pressure, and teams end up ignoring them or selectively interpreting them. A better approach is to make policies principle-based but boundary-clear, and then make standards precise in the areas that matter most for risk and alignment. Policies should define what outcomes and boundaries are non-negotiable, while standards should define the minimum requirements that preserve those outcomes across contexts. This design keeps governance stable while allowing local teams to apply standards in a way that fits their operational reality. Another misunderstanding is believing that strictness automatically creates compliance, when strict policies with no usable path for urgency often lead to the opposite effect: widespread bypass. A third misunderstanding is assuming that if people are well trained, governance will work, but training cannot overcome a system that is slow, unclear, or inconsistent. Governance must therefore design policies and standards with human behavior in mind, expecting that pressure will happen and ensuring compliance remains achievable. When you keep these misunderstandings in view, you design governance that holds up in reality. To ensure policies and standards steer decisions consistently, governance must integrate them into operating rhythm and leadership habits, because rules that are not reinforced become suggestions. Integration means the same policy boundaries and standard requirements appear in funding decisions, change decisions, exception approvals, and performance reviews, so people encounter them as part of normal decision-making. It also means governance reviews whether policies are being followed and whether standards are producing the desired outcomes, using measures that reveal weak signals like rising exception volume or recurring incidents after changes. If reviews show that a policy is frequently bypassed, governance should treat that as a design signal, asking whether the policy is unclear, unrealistic, or missing a fast path for urgency. Governance should also treat repeated exceptions as a learning signal, because they may indicate that the standard is outdated or that shared services are not meeting enterprise needs. Beginners sometimes assume policies are enforced through occasional audits, but governance works better when reinforcement is routine and predictable, because routine reinforcement shapes behavior under pressure. When the operating rhythm keeps policies and standards visible, people are less likely to treat them as optional. This is how governance becomes the default, even when time is short. Policies and standards must also be designed to preserve fairness and trust under pressure, because urgency can amplify power dynamics and lead to inconsistent treatment of similar situations. If exceptions are granted to powerful stakeholders but denied to others, the culture learns that governance is political and compliance will collapse. Governance protects fairness by defining consistent criteria for exceptions, consistent thresholds for escalation, and consistent evidence requirements for approvals. Standards also protect fairness by ensuring that minimum protections apply regardless of who is requesting a change, because risk impact does not care about organizational rank. This fairness focus is not sentimental. It is operationally important because trust is what makes people comply quickly. When teams believe governance rules are applied consistently, they will use governance pathways rather than fighting or bypassing them. When teams believe governance is arbitrary, they will treat it as an obstacle to overcome. Beginners should recognize that fairness is a governance control because it influences adherence, and adherence influences risk and reliability. Designing policies and standards to be fair under pressure, therefore, helps the enterprise manage risk more effectively. To close, building policies and standards that steer decisions even under time pressure means designing governance rules as practical, objective-aligned guardrails that remain usable when urgency and emotion are high. Policies set clear decision boundaries and authority thresholds so people know who can decide and what cannot be silently accepted, while standards define minimum, measurable requirements and evidence expectations that keep behavior consistent. Exception paths are designed to be fast and legitimate so teams do not bypass governance, and friction is reduced through clarity, standardized decision inputs, and integration into normal operating rhythm. Evidence requirements protect accountability and enable learning. Sequencing rules keep fast decisions from being chaotic, and fairness ensures governance remains trusted rather than political. When policies and standards are built this way, governance becomes a stabilizing force during crises instead of a barrier, and the enterprise can move quickly without sacrificing coherence, compliance readiness, or long-term value. This is the practical maturity of governance. Decisions remain aligned, owned, and defensible, even when the clock is working against you.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.